Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are in Lesson 5 of the Gospel of Mark, and we're covering Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 19, and this one's called Well-Heeled Followers. We can get much insight into the love of Jesus by looking at his healing ministry. First, it reveals his compassion, and there is not a greater example of his compassion than the fact that God became man. Jesus left a perfect place for an imperfect one. The earth he came to was not the one he created, as sin had entered the picture since his creation. But Jesus joined us in our suffering. He healed all who asked to be healed, never turned anyone away. His healing was also a demonstration of the power of God. But sadly, the majority of those Jesus healed failed to realize the spiritual healing that Jesus also was offering. We still tend to focus on the physical realm rather than the more important spiritual realm. Let's read our first passage today. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 says this: "And he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, 'Step forward.' Then he said to them, 'Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they kept silent. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him." Once again, the word "and" at the beginning of this chapter connects this action with the action in the previous two chapters. The Pharisees are following Jesus around like pit bulls looking for a meal, rather than like puppy dogs looking for some love. What is most important to the Pharisees is whether or not Jesus is going to heal a man on the Sabbath. Isn't that sad? If the tables were turned and one of the Pharisees had the withered hand, I doubt they would be as concerned what day of the week it was, as they would just want that withered hand healed. I just had hand surgery after not being able to use my right hand correctly for about 3 years. I was so thankful to finally be able to get the surgery and restore usage of my hand, but it was so limiting for such a long time. I have much empathy for this man in the synagogue that day with the withered hand. This man went into the synagogue that day with severe hand issues and came out completely healed. Certainly that was not what he expected when he arose that day. Also notice that the man with the withered hand was spending the Sabbath in the synagogue with the Lord. What an amazing gift from Jesus. Of course, the Pharisees did not see it that way. The plot to kill Jesus begins. And here we see the initial plotters were the Pharisees and the Herodians. Herodians differed from the rest, as they had strong political feelings, but were mostly without religious or spiritual concerns. The Herodians tried to strike a balance with the Romans, and by appeasing the Romans, could obtain some power over the Jewish people. We should be familiar with the Pharisees by now. They were known for strictly following the Jewish law. We need to differentiate between Jewish law and God's law. God's law was what God gave to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai, the Torah. The Torah refers to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Pentateuch. These books contain the core of the Jewish faith. For Christians, these books are the same and begin the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But the Jews also added the Talmud, which is a collection of interpretations and discussions by rabbis concerning the Torah. Let me explain this. When a Bible teacher explains the meaning of a Bible passage, that interpretation by a man can be accurate or inaccurate, as the interpretation is man-given, not God-given. The Bible is God-given. Judaism elevated man's interpretation to the same level as the God-given verses of the Bible. Many times in the Bible, Jesus pointed out to the Jewish religious authorities that they were misinterpreting God's law. How would Jesus know? Well, he is God after all. Conservative Jews believe in the written Torah, along with oral traditions. The oral traditions include the Mishnah, which according to the Pharisees were also given directly by God at Mount Sinai. But the Mishnah was not carved into stone by God, unlike the law of the Torah. In addition, the Mishnah never was to be written down, but was to be passed down orally only. This changed when the Jews were under Roman rule and feared those traditions could be lost. In the interest of preservation, one rabbi decided to write these oral traditions down. The followers of Rabbinic Judaism state that the oral traditions explain the written Torah. Certainly, they think that the oral traditions also are divine authority. These include the Mishnah, which are the oral traditions written down in the 2nd century, the Talmud, which are rabbinic notes about the Mishnah, and the Gemara, a commentary on the Mishnah. This would be like attaching a Bible commentary to the Bible. The Bible is infallible, and anything man attaches is fallible. The Word of God never will return void. As hard as I work on these studies, your calling is to search the Scriptures daily to make sure that what I say is accurate, as I can make mistakes. God is incapable of making mistakes. Typically, the laws added by rabbis and other Jewish religious leaders were an attempt to keep the Jewish people away from sin. Think about the example that I explained in yesterday's lesson about Shabbat elevators in Jerusalem. On Shabbat, the elevators stop at every floor, going up and going down, so that Jews will not work on the Sabbath by pushing a button. The attempt by the Jewish religious leaders to protect God's law did more than God had intended by giving the law. If God needed help when he gave them the law, then God would not be God. This simple step of adding to the law revealed that the Jews had lowered God in their eyes, lessened God in their understanding of his infallibility and his lack of limitations. One example was that God told them to keep the Sabbath day holy, and the Jewish religious leaders created a whole system to keep Jews from working on the Sabbath. In fact, rabbis have assigned 39 different categories of work that should not be performed on the Sabbath. Man-made, not God-given. Interestingly, even in those 39 categories, it does not say that it was against the Jewish law for miracles to be performed on the Sabbath, and more specifically, for God to perform healings on the Sabbath. Let's read the next passage. Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 12 says this. But Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea and Jerusalem, and Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, and those from Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude, when they heard how many things he was doing, came to him. So he told his disciples that a small boat should be kept ready for him because of the multitude, lest they should crush him. For he healed many, so that as many as had afflictions pressed about him to touch him. And the unclean spirits, whenever they saw him, fell down before him and cried out, saying, You are the Son of God. but he sternly warned them that they should not make him known. Jesus withdrew from his disciples to the Sea of Galilee. Remember, the headquarters of the ministry of Jesus was on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, in the town of Capernaum. There was a great multitude following Jesus from the Galilee region, but people also came from Judea, Jerusalem, and Idumea. Idumea was south of Judea and also was south of the Dead Sea. In addition, people also were coming from beyond the Jordan River. There were 12 tribes of Israel in the 40-year wilderness journey, and 2.5 of those tribes chose to remain on the east side of the Jordan River. So the people described here could have been Jews, Gentiles, or a mixture of both. There also were people from Tyre and Sidon, which is north of Israel in what is Lebanon today. Jesus asked for his disciples to have a small boat ready for him. This was to create separation between Jesus and the encroaching multitude of people. Jesus clearly states that this was so that the people would not crush him. Once again, Jesus was 100% God and 100% man, and the part of him that was 100% man was concerned that the people could crush him. They would crush him on the cross and in the scourging before the cross. Many people seem to underestimate the healing ministry of Jesus when he was upon this earth. Jesus healed all who came to him. There are no examples of Jesus turning away anyone who asked for healing. It makes me wonder how many of those people had real issues that needed to be addressed. Imagine if this happened today. People would come out of the woodwork to have Jesus heal a hangnail. The saddest part of this is that people were addressing their physical desires, not their needs, as they were more wants than needs. But standing in front of them was God as man, who could address every spiritual need. Most importantly, Jesus had the ability to address their eternal destiny. But the people shrunk Jesus, shrunk their perceived power of Jesus. For many, Jesus was little more than a sideshow. We have a tendency to do the same, underestimating the spiritual healing that accompanies the moment we come to Jesus. While the people did not realize that this was the Son of God, the demons inside many of the people knew exactly who Jesus was. We can see 4 separate groups of those who were confronted by Jesus. First were his disciples, who knew Jesus was the Son of God, and also knew the importance of every word that he was teaching them. A second group would be the multitude who came for his physical healing, or just to see the physical healing. Some of these people might listen to his powerful words, and a handful might actually become followers of Jesus. But the vast majority were there for the show, or there to be healed and to return to their lives. A third group was of the Jewish religious leaders who were threatened by the knowledge that Jesus had of God's word. They were threatened by his signs and wonders and never ever seemed to give a single thought to the possibility that this could actually be the Messiah they had been waiting for. And finally, there were the demons, who were acutely aware that the Son of God was casting demons out from possessed people. I guess we could call them homeless demons because Jesus took them out of their homes. Let's read the next passage. Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 19 says this: "And he went up on the mountain and called to him those he himself wanted, and they came to him. Then he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach, and to have power to heal sicknesses and to cast out demons. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. And they went into a house. The selection process of the 12 disciples is described much differently in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Interestingly, Matthew was written by one of the disciples of Jesus, Matthew, also known as Levi, the Jewish tax collector. Mark was written through the eyes of Peter, who also had been chosen by Jesus. Matthew told us that Jesus chose Andrew, Peter, James, and John first. Perhaps this is where Jesus appointed the other 8. But in this passage, Mark tells us that Jesus went up on the mountain and called to himself those he wanted to follow him. I've always found it interesting that Jesus chose Judas Iscariot, knowing what Judas would do. That is a wonderful example of God's grace and how he gives us so many chances. Jesus had a secondary motive in choosing these disciples as he wanted to teach them and then send them out to preach. He would also give them the power to heal sicknesses and cast out demons. This statement is a precursor to the Great Commission that would come later. And after the ascension of Jesus, the 11 remaining apostles, and Paul, as we likely count him as the 12th apostle, would spread the gospel to the 4 corners of the earth. Everyone hearing these words or reading these words who is a Christian today has been affected by the work of these apostles. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.